If you look at every financial crisis throughout history, they tend to follow the same basic pattern. Think of the tulip mania in 1637, stocks in 1929, the dot-com bubble in 2000, or housing in 2008. These were all different assets in different decades and even different countries, but the cycle underneath it all was the same. And if these crises have taught us anything, it's that this is going to happen again. Not because people are stupid, but because the financial system itself creates the conditions for these booms and busts. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why things like this keep repeating and why even people who know the history, they still get pulled in. So the way these things typically start is with something new and exciting, a new technology, a new investment, or a new market that feels different from anything before it. Prices begin to rise, early investors make money, and word spreads. As prices start to go up, banks start lending against the rising asset, which brings in even more buying and pushes the asset price higher. And that's when euphoria kicks in. Everyone seems to be making money, prices keep climbing, and anyone who isn't invested starts to feel like they're being left behind. Eventually, reality sets in, and someone realizes the math doesn't make sense, prices are way too high, and the fundamentals don't justify the valuations. And that's when selling begins, panic sets in, and margin calls force more selling. And the entire cycle reverses fast. Prices start to collapse, sometimes within days, and wealth gets wiped out. People start to lose everything. Then, after a decade or two passes and memory fades, the same thing happens again with something new. This isn't some theory I'm just making up. It's a documented pattern going back hundreds of years. In 1637, tulip bulbs in the Netherlands were selling for more than 10 times the annual income of a skilled craftsman. At the peak, people were literally trading houses for a single flower bulb. So when the bubble burst, prices fell by 80 to 90% almost overnight. In a single day, you saw massive amounts of wealth fall apart. And that's not the only case. In 1929, years of speculation led to the stock market crash. On Black Thursday, nearly 13 million shares traded in a single day, and investors who had borrowed money to buy stocks were wiped out. And this was literally the trigger for the Great Depression. In 2000, the dot-com bubble collapsed after companies with no revenue were valued at billions of dollars, justified by the belief that the internet changes everything and old rules no longer applied. And in 2008, the housing market imploded after subprime mortgages grew from about 5% of all mortgages in the 1990s to roughly 20% by 2006. And banks were making loans people couldn't afford and selling them as securities around the world. When housing prices stopped rising, the entire system fell apart. All of these examples were different assets, but the same pattern. So why does this keep happening? Why don't people learn? Well, there are a few forces that make these cycles incredibly hard to avoid, and the first one goes straight back to how money is created in the modern system. When banks make loans, they expand the money supply. They're not just handing out existing savings, they're creating new deposits in the process. And when an asset starts rising in value, whether it's tulips, stocks, or houses, banks become more willing to lend against it. So if you want to buy a house, the bank lends you money, and that newly created credit pushes prices higher. Now your neighbor's house is worth more, so they can borrow more against their house, which leads to even more lending, and more money creation, and even higher prices. That feedback loop is what's known as credit expansion, and it acts like rocket fuel for bubbles. In the years leading up to 2008, subprime mortgages grew from around $35 billion in the mid-1990s to roughly $600 billion by 2006. So it wasn't just more loans, but a massive surge of new credit flowing into housing. And the same mechanism works in reverse. When the bubble pops and people start defaulting, banks pull back, lending dries up, money creation slows or reverses, and prices fall even faster. The boom sets up the bust almost automatically. Economists have described this dynamic for decades, and it all follows a similar pattern. Central banks start to lower rates, borrowing becomes cheap, Credit expands, asset prices surge, optimism takes over, and then reality hits. It's not really a flaw in the system as much as a built-in tendency of how credit-based economies work. But credit expansion alone doesn't explain why people keep falling for the same pattern, and that's because the second driver is human psychology. And this is where things get interesting because there's a term for this called irrational exuberance, which describes what happens when people stop thinking clearly about risk. So during bubbles, a few powerful instincts take over and people become extremely overconfident about the future. During the dot-com boom, investors were convinced the internet would change everything. And they were right, but they also convinced themselves that companies with no profits deserved infinite valuations. At the same time, herd behavior kicks in. Nobody wants to be the one who misses out. And when your neighbor is making money flipping houses, when your coworkers' tech stocks are doubling, and when everyone at dinner is talking about their gains, you start to feel left behind. Fear of missing out overrides logic, and risk suddenly feels invisible because everyone else is doing it. Then there's greed. Not like some cartoon evil greed, just normal human desire for security and a better life. The opportunity feels real, the gains look easy, and the longer prices keep rising, the more it feels like the people warning you were completely wrong. Warren Buffett once said about the 2008 housing bubble that it was the greatest bubble he had ever seen, and that eventually the entire public was caught up in the belief that housing prices could never fall. And the worst part is, going through a boom actually makes you more likely to participate in the next one. Once you've seen how fast wealth can be created, even if you lost money when the bubble burst, that memory sticks. So the next time something new starts rising, you jump in earlier because you don't want to miss out again. And in a way, the system trains people to repeat the same mistakes. The third driver in every financial crisis is financial innovation, or more accurately, the way risk gets hidden. In the years leading up to 2008, Wall Street created something called mortgage-backed securities. How they worked was banks would issue large numbers of mortgages, including a lot of subprime loans or just bad loans to people who couldn't really afford them. Then they would bundle those mortgages together and sell them as securities to investors. The idea was that even if some borrowers defaulted, the overall pool would be safe because most people would keep paying. But it didn't stop there. Those securities were then sliced into tranches or layers with different levels of risk. Some tranches were paid first and they were rated AAA and treated as if they were as safe as government bonds, while other tranches, they were riskier but they offered higher returns. Then those tranches were bundled into new securities and derivatives were created on top of those. By the end, you had securities built from tranches of securities, built from pools of mortgages, and there were tons of layers of abstraction just stacked on top of each other. And at that point, nobody could really assess the risk anymore or even understand what was going on. There were also credit rating agencies whose jobs were to evaluate how safe these investments were, and they would give AAA grade ratings to securities that were backed by subprime mortgages and were essentially worthless. Basically, what they were doing was giving AAA ratings, which is the best ratings, to things that were kind of like garbage. They were definitely not AAA. They weren't even near that. And the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, they later called these agencies key enablers of the financial meltdown, largely because they were paid by the very institutions creating the products they were supposed to judge. So they had a financial incentive to give higher ratings to more crappy things because they were getting paid to do it. And by mid-2008, more than 60% of all US mortgages had been securitized, and the entire system was built on loans many people couldn't afford, and they were packaged into products people barely understood. And they were labeled as safe by institutions with no real incentives to tell the truth. So when housing prices stopped rising and defaults began, the whole structure collapsed. And that's what makes modern financial crises so dangerous. The complexity hides the risk until it's already too late. Now, even though everyone knows the history, every bubble has a story that sounds completely rational at the time. Tulips were rare and exotic. a real status symbol, and owning the right bulb actually meant something. In the 1920s, the Industrial Revolution was creating unprecedented prosperity, and people believed the economy was fundamentally different now. During the dot-com era, the internet really was going to change everything. So investors convinced themselves the old rules didn't apply. And in 2008, housing felt safe because home prices had never fallen nationally in modern history, and everyone needs a place to live. The key lesson here is that every one of these justifications, they had some truth to it. And that's exactly what made them believable. But the problem is that when everyone believes the same story, when prices are rising and credit is expanding, fundamentals stop mattering. Prices go up not because the underlying value supports them, but because people expect prices to just keep going up. And by the time that belief breaks, it's already too late. That's why "this time is different" is often called the most dangerous phrase in finance, because it never actually is. The asset changes, the story changes, but the pattern stays exactly the same. So if the pattern is this predictable, why don't regulators just stop it? The short answer is that the incentives are broken, and governments sometimes have an interest in keeping the bubble going. Stopping a bubble means you have to raise interest rates, tighten credit standards, and start telling people no when they feel like they're getting rich. And politicians don't get rewarded for preventing a crisis that might not have happened anyway, they get punished for it. Voters hate it when you stop the train. But if you let bubbles keep inflating, you can get reelected during the boom, and by the time it crashes, you can usually blame someone else for that. On top of that, there's the problem of moral hazard. In 2008, the government actually bailed out the largest banks with taxpayer money after they made catastrophically bad decisions. The message that was sent was simple. If you're big enough, you won't be allowed to fail. So why not take massive risks? If it works, you keep the profits. If it doesn't, the losses get socialized. And that's not really capitalism. It's a system that quietly rewards risk-taking without fully pricing in the downside, and it creates the conditions for the next crisis. So why does this matter for someone who's not a Wall Street investor? Because when these crises hit, regular people pay the price. After 2008, unemployment hit 10%. Millions of people lost their homes, retirement accounts were cut in half, and families that had nothing to do with subprime mortgages or mortgage-backed securities saw their wealth evaporate. And the people who caused the crisis, most of them kept their jobs and some of them even got bonuses. And the aftermath affects you for decades. Interest rates stay low for a decade after bubbles to try to restart the economy, and that's great if you're borrowing, but terrible if you're trying to save, because your savings account earns nothing while inflation eats away at your purchasing power. You also start to see government debt explode because of bailouts and stimulus spending, and that debt eventually shows up as either higher taxes or inflation. So the cycle, it doesn't just destroy wealth, it redistributes it away from the people who are being responsible and towards the people who are taking insane risks. And now that you understand these patterns, you can change how you think about risk. When everyone around you is making easy money on the same thing, that's not a signal to jump in, it's a signal to be cautious. When people start saying, "this time is different," or "the old rules don't apply," that's not innovation, that's the same story that's been told in every bubble for 400 years. And look, at the end of it all, you can't control the system, but you can choose not to be the person holding the bag when the music stops.